Hey, I wanted to do a video kind of going over my 5-star read since I started reading. I feel like this is pretty unique depending on the person and how they got into reading, and hopefully it gives you some ideas if you're just getting into reading or you're just getting into fantasy. A lot of these are fantasy. I think one might be considered, I would say, more sci-fi than fantasy personally, but they're all pretty much fantasy. So the first book that I ever picked up was Uglies by Scott Westerfeld. And this is a series with 4 books in it. It's Uglies, Pretties, Specials, and Extras. And I remember the original covers of these because I actually started this series when I was probably in like the 6th or 7th grade. I actually watched the movie adaptation on Netflix. And I have to say, if you've already seen the movie on Netflix and you haven't read the books yet, I feel like they kind of made it more like their typical kind of cookie cutter movies that they've been coming out with, more than the world that I kind of built when reading this. This was again, the book that got me into reading, along with the Hunger Games series. And I think if I were to reread this, I don't know if I'd give it a 5 stars. And I plan on kind of rereading my 5 stars later on to see if they hold up. But it's a really fast-paced, fun book. The next 5-star read that I have is The Cruel Prince. I loved this trilogy. This book got me into fantasy. I loved the Spiderwick Chronicles, which I just found out recently that Holly Black was like a co-author on, and I loved that growing up, and when reading this, it reminded me of something, and when I found out that she also helped write Spiderwick Chronicles, I'm like, this makes so much sense, because the characters in this book are so like reminiscent of those characters in like Spiderwick Chronicles. Like, it's a very like whimsical kind of fantasy. It's not a typical fantasy where people just have pointy ears and for the most part are just stronger, and you know, like they have some really unique characters in this. This book is not a fantasy romance. When I started the series and finished it, it was within like a week. It was my introduction to fantasy and romance. So I thought that it had more romance than it did. And that was my impression because I hadn't read ACOTAR and I hadn't read all of these other books, especially the fantasy romance ones. This one does have politics in it. I typically stray away from books that have a lot of politics or series that have a lot of politics. It's kind of out of my comfort zone. And I like kind of reading books that are more whimsical and about the romance and stuff like that now. But it wasn't hard to understand. It was pretty interesting, especially the first book. I would try out the first book. Yeah, if you want a fun, quick read, I would say you could honestly get through this trilogy in like a week, depending on like what your interest level is in it as you're reading it. But it was a really quick series, and it was just like a fun, giggly time. Alright, so I would say my next 5-star read, it's more A Court of Mist and Fury, but I want an honorable mention for A Court of Thorns and Roses, specifically because I love Beauty and the Beast retelling. I actually had A Court of Thorns and Roses on my bookshelf for almost a year, and I was afraid to read it until one of my friends told me it's a loose retelling, but a Beauty and the Beast retelling. And in the first, like, very beginning of the book, that's what got me to kind of get through some of the beginning world building of the story and really get into it, because it was predictable. I knew what was going to happen. I knew that we were about to pick up in pace. So the beginning of this, I was intimidated getting into it, but knowing it was a Beauty and the Beast retelling, I feel like it has like a special place in my heart. And it's also, I love a shorter read. And when you look at the other books in the series, except for the novella, this is the quickest read out of all of them, or the smallest book, I should say. But I like it because there's not too much filler. We're first getting into the world. We're learning, what's going on. And it was a lot faster paced than some of the others in the series. So I would say this one was 5 stars for me. If I reread it today, I think it would drop down. And the only 5-star probably would be A Court of Mist and Fury, which I think is most people's opinion, is that this was their favorite book in the series. This one was so good. You don't have to do a lot of world building at this point because you did that in the first book. And this one is just a great time. It's a great, I hate saying great giggly time, but I was kicking my feet. I was having a fun time. I blew through this book. And after this book, it did not go that way necessarily with the rest of the series, except for the novella, but this was one of my favorites. There's a famous quote that comes from this book, and it was my first bookish tattoo. And I also have Valaris tattoo as well. So in the future, if you want a tattoo tour, I can do that as well, because we have quite a few bookish tattoos. So my next 5-star read is Fourth Wing, which I feel like a lot of these are kind of predictable. My last 2 recommendations, I don't think everyone has gotten to yet, but this one, if you have not gotten to Fourth Wing, I'm not gonna overly hype it up because I think that might ruin it. I kind of went into this knowing that everybody really loved it, but also knowing that some people felt it was maybe overhyped. So I had some doubts about it, and I also had doubts because I hadn't read many books in fantasy. I only read the Cruel Prince trilogy and ACOTAR at this point, so I didn't have much to go off of. So by the time I read this, it really blew me away. But again, I feel like if you have a lot of experience in fantasy and reading other fantasies, it might not like blow you away completely, but it's a great time. I love how this book begins. We get right into it, which I appreciate. All right, my next 5-star read is Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent. And this book opened my eyes to vampires and fantasy. I loved this. The beginning of the book really got to me. If you've read it before, you might know what I mean. The nicknames in this book, they make me cry. Anytime I read highlights and annotations of this book. I love this series. I would say my 5-star out of the series was probably the last book, which is interesting because I remember it going slower for me, being slower pacing. But 6 Scorched Roses, which is the novella, this is the book that you would read technically after this one. This one, and I've heard other people say this, was the best novella that I have read. Now, I haven't read a lot of novellas, but I was thinking about skipping this one. And to all my friends that have read this series after me, they've asked similar things. Do I need to go out and buy the novella? Yeah, I would say so. One of my friends that did not, and read the second book first, and then read this one, regretted doing so. And it's not gonna ruin, you can go from the first to the third, I guess it's the second. You can just read the duology, which the second one is The Ashes and the Star-Cursed King, is a second book. You can just jump from the first to the second and not read the novella in the middle. But I feel like, the friend that didn't kind of regretted it because they're about 2 characters that are in the second book, and you have such a better idea of their story by reading this one. So I would say definitely read the novella in the series. And it's really only, she's coming out with one, which is about a different character's point of view that I can't wait to get to. But it's really only 3 books. And this one's just, it's small. It's like, let me see how many pages it is. It went by so quick. It's under 200 pages. Just to read it really quick. You'll have all of the books and the context and everything else. Right, so I might have said that that was my last 5-star read. I don't remember. But this is my last 5-star read. And this, it's a crime that this has been on my shelf for as long as it has. I was intimidated by this book because it was sitting on my shelf. And I was like, I don't know if I can get through this book right now. And I heard that the Kingdom of the Wicked trilogy, you technically read before this. And I wasn't really feeling YA. I was kind of in like a new adult phase. I feel shame for not reading this sooner. This has to be one of my favorite reads. I don't want to say of the year, but at the same time, I did write this book 5.5 stars. This is my highest rated book currently. I loved Fourth Wing, but something about this book, characters in this book, I felt the tension in this book unlike any other. It was like I was living through it. This really showed me what enemies to lovers can be. And so did the second one, Throne of Secrets, that just came out. Really showed me the power of enemies to lovers. And I'm so grateful. It was great. I had a great time. This one has to be currently my top read of the year. I don't know if that's going to change because I don't know how many more books I'm going to get through, but I might do a separate video which is like my top reads of the year. Because some of these I hadn't read. I already went over within the year. Like Cruel Prince trilogy I didn't read this year. A Court of Mist and Fury and A Court of Thorns and Roses I hadn't read this year. The Uglies series hadn't read this year. So I think I could do a top reads of the year because I do have more to share. But this book is so good. So if you're looking for a read with princes of hell and demons and an adventure and like plot as well as spice, this is it. This is it. If you haven't read it already, please let me know when you get to it. Well, that's pretty much it. Those are my 5-star reads and above, because Throne of the Fallen was 5.5. But yeah, I feel like most of these you might have already read and aren't on your 5-star list. And part of that is I was pretty generous when I read them with my 5-star reviews. I hadn't read a lot, and now that I've read quite a few books, I'm realizing, you know, I'm a little generous with my reviews, or I have been. So I've been kind of, you know, recalibrating that as I read, as I go along. Anyway, that's it for this video. I hope you liked kind of going through my 5-star reads and my book recommendation. Yeah, that's it. See you in the next one.